find me Reeves in smiles. I'm going to get so lit up, I'll be visible for miles.
I'm going to get lit up when the lights go up in London. Lit up when the lights go up again. And I only know those two lines. But that was the spirit of the blackout will be over. We'll be able to walk the streets. And I was out on VE Day, and I remember Queen Victoria with a pigeon on her head, an orange in one hand and a glass of beer in the other, statue, you know, and people laughing and shouting and full of hope.
For 5 long years, the future had refused to be born. But out of the dark wreckage of war, Britain emerged as a country invigorated by a new hope. And it was soon to be a country with a new government, a new Labour government.
Chairman and comrades, I have this evening accepted His Majesty's commission to form.
In the 1945 election, over 80% of the armed forces voted Labour, creating the democratic tide that would sweep Clement Attlee's party into power.
One positive thing the war does, presumably, I don't know whether it does now, but it certainly then, is to pull people together. And during the war, this community spirit in the air raid shelters was formed very, very deeply. And the whole feeling of the beginning of a new kind of life. The Labour government was a huge bright star on the horizon, and there was optimism.
There was an atmosphere amongst the working people of this is at long last the Jerusalem that they were certainly promised after the last war, the First World War, and it really was going to be their world this time.
We were fighting because it's got to be different. They didn't want the 30s and the dole and the hunger marches. It's got to be different, and there was a real sense of, well, if you were building on the graves of your friends who'd been killed, you weren't going to let that all go for nothing.
The new Labour government faced many tests. Perhaps the most basic and most challenging of them all was to give the people of Britain decent homes to live in.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. There'll be tears and laughter and peace ever after. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. The shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see.
We had been bombed badly, and it wasn't only a question of people whose homes had been bombed, but the servicemen who were coming home. The children had been evacuated, and some of them were beginning to get to adolescence. And there was a totally different spirit from what there is now, that people had a right to a home.
I am not prepared to associate myself with a policy where well-to-do people can afford to build luxury homes and poor people go without homes. And therefore, houses had to be built to rent and not to sell, because it doesn't seem to have dawned upon some people in this country that the vast majority of us can't afford to buy a house.
A land fit for heroes and a right to a home. An old idea for a brave new world. But over 3.5 million victorious troops were returning to the cruel real world of post-war Britain. There were 1 million slums due for destruction. Over 3 million existing homes had no toilet. Nearly 500,000 houses had been destroyed or made uninhabitable through bombing. Rationing was at its height, and essential building materials were in short supply. Nissen huts and emergency housing were the temporary solutions. But these ugly structures were to long outstay their welcome as sufficient permanent housing failed to materialise. Although Bevan's speeches on the housing problem remained optimistic, it was increasingly clear that his party's promises could not be fulfilled. Ever more desperate people took desperate measures.
I think there was a lot of upheaval in when people were coming back to settle down again. Conflict in finding places to live, how to live, where to settle.
Now a story from Scunthorpe in Lincolnshire, which Movietone presents without prejudice or comment. This is a disused military gun site which has been taken over by people urgently needing somewhere decent to live. I understand there are about 2,000 families at Scunthorpe awaiting homes. Some of these squatters, you might call them, have apparently taken the law into their own hands. A committee has been formed by these people under the chairmanship of the first resident.
We take the view that any right-minded men would agree with the action our desperation forced us to take.
An infuriated and impotent government did its best to make squatting a label for lawlessness and anarchy. Despite this, squatting as a means of finding a home continued to grow. By the end of August 1946, over 1,000 army camps from Scotland to Somerset had been occupied by nearly 40,000 people.
And Mrs. Clark, your husband, he's ex-serviceman?
Yes, he had 5.5 years in the services.
And why did you come here?
Because we were all in one bedroom, 5 of us. I had 3 children and the eldest one's 13. And it wasn't right that she should be in the same bedroom as her daddy and I. We also had no sanitary arrangements and no lighting, and we had to carry our water 100 yards.
To find out what you think about it, our reporters present an opinion poll. From the hundreds who gave their views on squatting, we bring these representative voices.
I agree with it as a genuine case. I mean, say, ex-servicemen and all that, they want a decent place to come home to, don't they?
What do you think about it?
Well, on private property, I think it's all wrong, but on taking over army camps, I think they're entitled to. After all, they've had 6 years fighting in the army, they're entitled to a home, isn't it?
Peacetime battle report. The siege of London's Ivanhoe Hotel. On the pavement, police, pressmen and squatter sympathisers. Facing government action to evict them, the squatters carry on as best they can. Food supplies come up from below. Wholesale squatting in luxury flats and hotels turns the spotlight on a still desperate housing situation. Labour leaders say lawless acts by squatters can only lead to injustice and anarchy.
Now, Bevan, I believe at the time, was on holiday in Switzerland. And when he was told that people were occupying empty buildings and hotels in the West End for accommodation, many with children in arms, infant. His famous words were, infamous words were, how dare these people try and jump the queue?
Well, in my humble opinion, I don't think that whilst there's any people in this country who require a place to live in, there should be any empty flats whatsoever. And it's not a matter, in my opinion, of being right or wrong. It's a question of the people letting the government see that they require these places to be taken over, that they mean business.
It was certainly as a result of the then squatters' campaign, a genuine desire to have a roof over their heads, that the the government was enforced to bring in the Requisitioning Act. That was the trigger. And that certainly then gave borough councils, local authorities, power to requisition empty properties.
Requisitioning did more than open doors to empty houses. It opened people's minds to how things could be different in their society. For a few, it provided a glimpse of the future that so many had fought and died for.
Local authorities had the power to take over empty property. And in Holborn, where I was living at the time, in Montague Street actually, which runs alongside the British Museum, those houses had been hotels. And there they were, empty, and the council requisitioned them. They did a minimum amount of work in order to turn them quickly into housing units. And it must have been about 35 families that moved into those temporary flats. That was in 1947, and of course they were to be there until about 1954, 1955. It wasn't long before a kind of spontaneous community feeling arose.
We had games, we had dancing in the hall, we had a newsletter that kept coming out every week telling people what was it all about, what was this and what was that and what was coming. And I think that got everybody together and sort of built up a community that was hard to knock down.
We also had meetings of a more serious nature on housing, on education, on bringing up children, the best way to bring up children. They were evening meetings and they were always well attended. We would do those about every couple of months or so. We also opened a boys' club, which was open every night of the week.
We had a washing machine, which people had never had in their own homes in those days at all. So we developed a rota for people to do their washing, and the cooperation between people brought them again closer together. And it was a wonderful thing. It was an atmosphere which I have never experienced before or since, because it was not competitive in any way.
We in Montague Street formed a tenants' association, which became so successful that people from all over the borough were applying to join. And we were very fortunate in Montague Street because one of the houses, which had been a hotel, had an enormous dining room. And that was vacant. It was just standing there and doing nothing. We appealed to the council for use of this dining room, and there was the base for a very successful community association.
The Tenants Association was the backbone of the community, and that's what got everybody together, no matter what nationality.
African, Chinese, Irish, German, Jewish, and of course London Cockneys, a few businessmen, an incredible mixture of people who got on so well together.
We had a Miss J, didn't we, teaching the children dancing in the hall of the community, and how many was there? Seven of us, mums, that decided we'd go to the dancing classes, and Miss J taught us the can-can.
We made our own dresses, with those beautiful black dresses with the lovely colours underneath, yellows and bright green and red, orange, and the kids loved us. That's my mum. That's what Hayden used to say. That was wonderful.
Our children were playing on a very busy street. There was nowhere else for them to play. The flats were tiny and the conditions were cramped. So the kids were on the doorsteps and in the street and so on. And we'd looked at this garden many times and thought, we really ought to have that garden. It's doing nothing. And then came the sad day when a child was run over by a taxi. And it was a horrendous situation and very sad. And from that moment on, the Tenants Association went into action to try and get that garden. And we approached the Borough Council, and to our surprise, they requisitioned it.
Those who had children used to stay home and do their turn in the garden watching the children, didn't we? We had a rota, duty rota, that the mothers that didn't work used to sit and watch the children in the garden.
A lot of people wanted to participate at that time. That's the feeling I had. And certainly within the tenants' movement in the borough, there was that sort of feeling.
There was a feeling of going right down to the children, of being a part of something, and that what you did mattered.
Prepared to take responsibility for your own lives. What you had a right to expect. Do you know what I mean? That was legitimately yours, what you had a right to. After all, you know, you'd been through a war and made a hell of a lot of sacrifices.
But it would have been part of, I would imagine, an upsurge of people's spirit when they realised that they had been kept distant from culture, distant from privilege. I mean, that was very definitely in the air. People felt they had a voice. They felt they were entitled, I think. That's what was waking up. That in that period, people, in a sense, were released to talk to one another and to realise they didn't have to live in the ghettos of either age or class that they had been confined to.
After 5 years in office, Labour had to defend its record at the polls. The Labour government had implemented the 1944 Education Act and the Beveridge Report to bring about the welfare state. The National Health Service had been introduced and key industries nationalised. But for many people, day-to-day life had changed little. Wages were falling and unemployment rising. Food rationing was still in force. The reforming impetus had been lost, and discontent with the speed of reconstruction was reflected in a swing away from Labour, resulting in a hung Parliament. A second election, in 1951, saw Churchill's Conservative Party gain power with a small majority.
Well, many working class Tories went out and did their so-called duty and voted Tory. Many Labour supporters, as I can reflect back in our own borough, and certainly all over London, the pattern proved that they stayed at home and abstained rather than go to the ballot box, saying in effect that there won't be much difference between this Labour government now and a new Tory government.
But there were some clear ideological differences between the parties. For Conservatives, private property was sacrosanct. Their solution to the housing problem was twofold: increase the private sector and, in the public sector, put quantity before quality.
Nye Bevan, when he was Minister of Local Government and Housing, he wanted to have a lavatory upstairs and downstairs, so that when the children came in from the garden, or father came home from the coal pits, all dirty, they didn't have to go upstairs and dirty the place. And I can remember Nye saying, well, you know, well-to-do people often have 2 toilets. Well, Macmillan crossed that out and said that was an extravagance. And if we put 2 toilets in every house, then we would have fewer houses.
£4,000 produces 4 of these houses, less than the cost of 3 of the former houses. And therefore the question that we must ask is, for the expenditure of £4,000, would you prefer to house 4 families in these excellent approved houses, or 3 families in a former type, in which case the 4th family will still be on the waiting list? Quicker to build, cheaper to rent. And those are fairly good recommendations for the 1952 and the 1953 vintage.
The Conservatives enjoyed an economy that was finally paying its wartime debts. The country was celebrating the coronation of a new queen. The country looked forward. The government returned to the altar of private property. Local councils were encouraged to press ahead with derequisitioning.
When we started, the television really started to come out, naturally, you need an aerial. So up onto the roof they went. Well, then the man from Bedford,
The bailiff.
bailiff from Montague Street, he used to come round, have a look at the place, make sure that no brickwork was being damaged, and of course he's gone up onto the roof and there's all the television aerials. And they threatened us, said if we didn't take them down, we would all be fined £5.
You weren't allowed to put your washing out onto the balcony. I could understand that because it does look unsightly if it's all hanging up high, but it wasn't, because there was a rather thick railings and you could not, you couldn't see it, not really. They just didn't want us because...
Well, it was a hotel, wasn't it, opposite?
Yeah, they used to complain because they didn't want ordinary people living in requisitioned property opposite, because I think they thought that it lowered the tone.
The hotels didn't like the noise of the children playing in the garden, and I think it's possibly them that started all the business with the garden. They probably applied to the Duke of Bedford saying it was killing their trade or something, because the people didn't want noisy children playing in gardens.
We got a letter saying that we had to return the key to the garden within 48 hours. They gave no justification whatsoever, but obviously what they wanted to do was not only begin to de-requisition the houses, but de-requisition the garden in order to turn it into its former showpiece, as it was before the war. Private, it was a private garden, and the hotels and residents paid, I think, £1 a year for a key, and it was for their exclusive use. We called an emergency committee meeting, and we took a decision to refuse to return the key, because that would have meant the garden locked against the children. And by that time, of course, there were more children, because the little ones, the tiny ones, had grown bigger, and more children in between had been born. So anyway, we really did go into battle about this ultimatum to return the key.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. There'll be tears and laughter and peace ever after. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. The shepherd will tend his sheep. The valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see.
A group of the mums got together and decided to go to Whitehall to try and see Mr. Macmillan and put our case to him. And we did that every day for a week. And to our utter amazement, on the very last day, an official emerged from the building and said, "Oh, are you the ladies from Montague Street?" "Yes." "Oh, do come in," he said. And we were ushered into a room, and there were two officials there, and we were told that Mr. Macmillan had agreed that we could have the garden for a further year.
Within a year, most of the residents of Montague Street had left their requisitioned housing, and the garden was returned to the Bedford estate. It was the end of a small but important struggle. Throughout the country, such local difficulties were fading into history, but the issues they raised were never really resolved at the time, nor have they been since.
Although the families were very grateful for the requisitioning order, which suddenly gave them a home, those homes were not adequate. They were very makeshift. I mean, they didn't have dining rooms and a sitting room and so on, you know, it was kind of all in one, and then a little bedroom here and there. And they knew it was temporary and they made the most of it, but they wanted something better. They didn't want to be in a situation where they were temporary. That was what the feeling was. The yearning for a permanent home. And of course, most of them all wanted a detached house with a garden. I certainly did.
It was never as bad as it is now. Very few homeless before the war were slept on the embankment, on seats in the summer. But it was never, never, never as bad as it is now. The equivalent amount of people that are sleeping rough and homeless compares with the number of empty properties and vacancies that there are. Well, really, what's stopping those people from embodying the spirit of the returned servicemen after the war in finding accommodation for their new young families in the hotels of Bloomsbury that were standing empty, and the other empty houses which forced the Labour government to carry out a requisitioning campaign?